1960s Eastern European science fiction dubbed over into English classic, First Spaceship to Venus. I first became aware this movie existed because it was recommended to me by YouTube, where it is available to be watched for free. I will try to remember to include the link below, but you could also look it up. I did notice that the IMDb entry, there was a critic who cited that they first saw it on Mystery Science Theater, which makes sense, it would be of their genre. What's really fascinating about First Spaceship to Venus is how good it is for the era that it comes from. And there was a lot of science fiction movies from the late 50s through the 60s, even the early 70s, that are very poor, some in black and white, some in color, or I should say that haven't held up well, with men from the moon and people dressed up in funny outfits prancing around in what pretends to be lunar dust, etc. Things that were interesting at the time but became very quickly dated with advances in space, the space program, and actual space travel to places like the moon and sending our satellites out into space. However, First Spaceship to Venus is one of those unique ones that really seems to hold up well, despite what we now know or expect, what we believe we know about Venus based on our limited exploration of the planet. Nevertheless, the movie does a good job of tying together a cohesive, very global feeling narrative. It is the distant future of, I believe they say, 1985. And they reference the Tunguska event, the explosion in Eurasia in 1912, I believe it was. That is the stuff of lore among ufologists and studiers of historical mysteries generally. I mentioned that event as being the explosion of a spaceship in the context of this movie that turns out to have been from Venus. They discover a spool in the desert preserved of magnetic tape. Incredible technology for the time, of course, before the tape deck became a daily thing. And people that are my age remember that, and people younger than me are going to be like, what is he talking about? Nevertheless, they discover the tape and they begin to decode or attempt to translate the extraterrestrial language. They become convinced that the craft that blew up over Tunguska came from Venus. We, by this time, in this distant future of 1985, have a space station on the surface of the moon, and they are planning a rocket to go to Mars with a manned mission. They change their minds and they send the manned mission to Venus instead to try to make contact with the Venusians. Now, a fascinating series of things develops on their way. They begin to interpret the message on the spool. They realize that actually the Venusians are hostile. They're intending to radiate the Earth with lethal doses of radiation in an across-space distant attack to annihilate us. They're not able to get that warning back to Earth. They decide not to turn back to Earth to try to warn them, but rather the smartest course being to go on to Venus, try to make contact with the Venusians and maybe talk them out of it, dissuade them in some fashion. When the Terran ship arrives at Venus, they discover that there's nobody there. They find eventually what turns out to be the evidence of a devastating atomic accident. They land in a glass forest that is vitrified, apparently by the radiation, and they discover a very alien landscape and terrain, and eventually uncover that the Venusians, all that's left of them being their shadows on the wall from an atomic explosion of incredible magnitude, they have destroyed themselves with the weapon they were plotting to use to destroy us. Rather poetic. But what's really fascinating, I think, that sets it apart as a movie production in 1960 is the attention to detail that is paid to special effects. Everything on the ship, everything they discover on the alien planet, there is an attention to detail that makes it does not look all that different from what the original series of Star Trek would be several years later. A well thought out sort of planned instrumentation and panels that appear to do things. Like that later Star Trek, this mission undertaken by the humans is done by many nations cooperating on this mission of space exploration. And so we have people that represent various nations around the world, which is also an interesting facet of this. But really, the attention paid to the technology that includes the robot. There's a little droid. He looks like a miniature tank model with tank tracks. However, he has a very droid-like R2-D2 being a tank. An earlier form of the idea of this entity that rolls around and explores with you. It is like a rover well before we were putting rovers on other planets. And it is sort of like an android well before we had those concepts of R2-D2 and the little things that would zip around on wheels and follow us around. Obviously, those ideas existed, but not as well developed as they would become. The robot that they have with them, the little droid, is surprisingly futuristic for 1960. He is held up very well as something not unlike what we might design today. Also, there's the artificial intelligence aspect. They are actively playing a game of chess on board the ship against the artificial intelligence and doing okay. It goes back and forth against this artificial intelligence, which again really foresees a great deal of what would happen many decades later, especially with chess. But for me, it was immediately reminiscent of the three-dimensional chess on Star Trek that would be a staple on that show relatively right away. The second pilot, the first pilot with Kirk, had Kirk and Spock playing three-dimensional chess. And so we see that this is a thing in the future, still this game playing, and them playing against the artificial intelligence is particularly interesting. But above all, I would have to say the alien landscape. The alien landscape, they shied away not at all at making it appear very alien. It wasn't like a journey to Mars where suddenly they put a red scope on the camera so that everything has a red glow, but they're obviously oak trees. They really get to this glass forest, the way they describe it. It looks like a dark black forest having been devastated and vitrified into glass by a nuclear explosion. As they describe it, what you're seeing is convincing enough that you believe it, and it looks really cool rather than really ridiculous or silly. And also the places they go, the alien installation, the weird amorphous blob of whatever sort of organic matter, which they do talk about how they've discovered how to move matter into energy and energy into matter. The Venusians have learned how to switch it back and forth. And this amorphous blob that acts almost as if it's alive is actually matter made from energy, converting back and forth and so forth. But the facility looks alien, other than that there's a sphere and there's some lights. There's nothing about it that is reminiscent of human architecture. There's many of the black and white movies not long before this, people in costumes that were clearly borrowed from a movie about Genghis Khan suddenly are aliens, and architecture that was clearly ancient Rome in some movie is now an alien planet. This is not like that. Maybe they just threw this stuff together and made believe, but it actually works. I mean, it works in the sense that it strikes you as being alien architecture. Even the bodies. We never see the remains of the Venusians except their shadows, which is a very interesting connection to the nuclear blasts as we understood them, where ashes were piled in the shape of a shadow, where the shadows were cast on the ground and so on. And we get to see the shadows against the wall of these insidious creatures that planned to murder us all, but ended up murdering, as far as we can tell, all of themselves, driving their own species to extinction. And they look sort of humanoid, but what we get of their shadows are very jagged, very skinny, long, oddly insectoid, almost looking appendages that, again, the detail, rather than just drawing an arm as we know it or copying, holding it against the wall and making the shape, they took the time to make it look alien. And so I would say I rank it very highly for that era. It was very well thought through, very well put together. It has a certain compelling quality about it that, again, unlike others of the era, it really holds up well. I was surprised. It was one of those things I clicked on YouTube thinking I'd watch a couple minutes and turn it off. And there's a lot of those old movies on YouTube I've done that with, but I just couldn't seem to stop watching it. And when the dubbing over of the voices got weird, and there were a few places that I thought, yeah, I had to keep watching it. And now I have watched it twice because that was over a year ago, and I just watched it again so that I could review it. So go check it out. First Spaceship to Venus.